there's basically three basic ways we can reduce emissions. First, we can subsidize investment in low and zero emission technologies, and I'll return to this in a moment. Second, we can think about ways in which we use regulations to prescribe low and zero emission technologies. We may actually have requirements that call for very specific kinds of technologies or perhaps performance standards, but we think about this as ways to craft regulations under existing statutory authorities, perhaps give regulatory agencies new statutory authorities by which they can develop and implement regulations on these emissions. And the other is to think about how we might raise the price of fossil energy. And this is what's motivated a lot of discussion about approaches such as carbon dioxide cap and trade programs, like what we have in the EU, we have in California, we have here in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states in our power sector. Those cap and trade programs and basically ration the amount of CO2 that can be emitted within that system. And that kind of cap and trade program raises the price of carbon, that hence raises the price of fossil energy. Alternatively, we could directly tax fossil energy based off of its carbon content, something that we've seen done through some Northern European countries in the province of British Columbia, and something that's been experimented with some emerging economies around the world. But we can either make the zero carbon stuff cheap through subsidies, we can either limit what kind of technologies we use that contribute to CO2 emissions, or we can make the really dirty, carbon-intensive activities more expensive. The evidence when looking back at the clean energy spending is that it probably created something a little shy of about 1 million job years. This is the term that the CEA and CEO tend to use when trying to evaluate labor market impacts. Quite substantial in how it leveraged private sector spending. And so it's one way to sort of think about this. If we're trying to subsidize infrastructure, we can either have the government sort of fully fund infrastructure. So think about road building, for example, that's paid for exclusively by the federal government. Or we could think about, say, something in how we use tax credits to leverage private sector investment in energy generating technologies. There we may say, in the case of solar, have a 30% tax credit, so the government pays 30% of the investment cost, but it's leveraging private sector resources to come in as a part of that investment that covers that other 70% of the solar capacity investment. We saw really dramatic growth in renewable power as a result of the Recovery Act. And in fact, in 2020, we had about 4 times as much wind capacity as what we had in 2008. And if you look at the upper figure here on our right, you can see that we had much higher levels of wind power, installed wind power capacity than what had been forecast by the statistical agency of the Department of Energy in 2009. If we look at the bottom panel there for solar, you can see the huge increase in solar capacity. Solar capacity in 2010 was 100 times its level in 2008, dramatically higher than what was forecast at the time. I think one thing that's important when we think about the role of subsidies is not just what are we spending right now and how much does that sort of bring out the technology being deployed in the market today, but how by building out that market, it creates incentives for the manufacturers to make investments to lower the cost of those technologies. And over time, it makes it more and more economic for us to deploy the wind and solar technology. So some of the significant gains I think that we've realized in solar over the last 5 years are in part reflecting the large subsidies that we saw in the Recovery Act in 2009 and 2010. But I think there are some important shortcomings when we look at the Recovery Act's clean energy spending that's worth thinking about in the context of both an infrastructure package, but also how we think about rebuilding the economy and creating jobs as we come out of the COVID recession. First is that some of these policies were not well targeted. For example, there was a program called Cash for Appliances, sort of analogous to what you may recall of Cash for Clunkers that targeted automobiles. For Cash for Appliances, states could provide rebates for anyone who went out and bought an Energy Star rated appliance. And as it turns out, a lot of people were going to buy Energy Star rated appliances anyway. So we're not getting much environmental benefit for the buck there. Second, in some of these major projects supported by the Recovery Act, the non-federal partners withdrew from the projects. So one, we had several $1 billion set aside for a carbon capture and storage coal-fired power plant that was never built because the utility sector partners withdrew from the project. They didn't have the interest in providing the resources to help bear their share of the cost for it. Second, as many of you recall, is high-speed rail was quite a big part of at least the rhetoric around the Recovery Act, but in practice has seen very little investment, in part because a number of the key states withdrew their interest in funding for that. And we also saw a slow rollout of some of the programs, which is important if you're thinking about this in the context of stimulus. And if you're thinking about the need to sort of quickly turn over the energy capital stock to help drive down emissions and get down to these ambitious goals we teed up at the beginning, For example, the loan guarantee program of the Department of Energy spent almost none of its monies until very late in the program, into 2011. So we went through all of 2009, all of 2010 with almost no monies appropriated through this program because it ended up being a very transaction cost intensive process. So when I think of some of the key lessons from this is first, be opportunistic. You want to find a legislative vehicle and bring in your clean energy subsidies into that. So I think is why we've seen some discussion. In fact, the last budget bill that passed had extensions of tax credits for renewables, and why I think an infrastructure package will have many things, some of which may be beyond traditional concepts of infrastructure, but many things supporting the spending on clean energy. Second is the need to target. We're going to get much more environmental benefit if we're able to really effectively target our policies. I think this is going to be important because the kind of spend we need to get to net zero is measured in the trillions of dollars. Third, keep it simple. Those simpler designs like tax credits, the grants in lieu of tax credits that supported renewable power were much more effective at driving investment. Fourth, I'd say it's important to sort of take some actions, learn what works, and then act and build on those lessons. And finally, make sure that we keep our eye on the prize. What is it we need to be investing in if we're going to be zero carbon in the power sector by 2035? We can think about what Treasury would do on stimulus and infrastructure bills. And there have been pieces of legislation introduced in recent years for a carbon tax. If we're going to do that, that's going to get implemented through Treasury. So they'll have a lot of thoughts about both the design and the implementation of such an approach. The Secretary of the Treasury chairs the FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Committee, that pulls together all the financial regulators. And this council is one where many people have said we need to get serious about elevating the issue of climate change, because it may be very difficult to think about how we could diversify out of climate change risks. So we may think about that as being potentially a systemic threat to the financial system, and use that as a way to really spur action by financial regulators throughout the federal government to tackle climate change. Treasury can play a key role in the interagency process, working with EPA and Department of Energy and Department of Transportation and other agencies on environmental regulation that can lower CO2 emissions. The Secretary of the Treasury is the representative of the United States in many international economic policy venues, such as the G20. The Secretary of the Treasury can really, I think, elevate this issue as an economic issue, not just an environmental issue, with our allies around the world. The Secretary of the Treasury chairs the trust fund boards for Social Security and Medicare. You can highlight the challenges and the risks posed by climate change if you start to say, well, what are the implications of a changing climate on, say, worker productivity, on healthcare expenditures, on what may be the financial positions of both Social Security and Medicare in the long term, in part because that board has to make an annual report to Congress and to the public about the financial standing of those trust funds. So you can help illustrate how the implications of climate change will sort of permeate through the economy and affect the status and condition of those trust funds as well.